welcome everybody. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Beth Stewart, and along with Richard Hooper, I am the co-director of the Pragmatic Trials Unit here at Queen Mary in Whitechapel, and we are so pleased to welcome you all to the conference today. Over the next 2 days, we have a fantastic program that the organizing committee have put together. And we're just really excited for those of you back in the room to be with you, to have an opportunity to share ideas, to have access to the lovely space here at the gallery. Today, the exhibition that you've walked through to get here is open, so please do take advantage of that. Tomorrow, the galleries themselves will be open, so next time we meet, we look forward to your art-inspired talks from today. To those of us who are on Zoom, welcome to you as well. We're very glad that you can join us for the talks, and I will be keeping my fingers crossed that all of the technology works for you and you have a seamless and wonderful conference experience. So trying to embrace the hybrid life that we all now live post-pandemic. So welcome back. I'm going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping, hopefully, assuming I can figure out how to advance these slides. Ooh, no, I turned it off instead. Wonderful. See, if all of the technology goes wrong for me, then it won't go wrong for you. Well, never mind, I can still tell you what the housekeeping is while someone comes up here and rescues me from my own stupidity. So the first thing you need to know is the fire exit is over there. If for any reason we do need to leave, please leave via that door and assemble at the fire point. Someone will guide you to where we need to be, and I believe it's at the White Hart pub. I don't know where that is either, so we will follow the gallery staff who will tell us where we need to go. Just make sure you get out of the burning building. That's the important thing. I've spoken to you about the gallery exhibition space. At break times, we'll be upstairs in the creative studio. There's a lift. Some of the staff from Queen Mary have passes to help you go up there in the lift, or you can take the stairs that you saw in the entryway when we came in. For those of you who are on Zoom, if you would like to ask questions, we do have someone monitoring the chat, so please do type them into the Q&A box, and the chairs of each session will ask whether there are any questions and ask them to the presenters on your behalf. For those of you in the room, we'll have a roving mic. I think I'm the one running around with it, so if you see me scurrying around, I will come to you if your hand is up and the chair calls on you. I think that is everything. We hope you have a wonderful time. I look forward to catching up with many of you during the break times and seeing your interesting talks. So I'm going to hand over to the first chair and away we go.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Liz Turner. I'm so thrilled to be here. You can hear I'm British, but I flew in from the States yesterday. Many of you know I'm based at Duke. I have been Duke University in North Carolina. I have been for 10 years, and this is the first time in 3 years I've been back to London. So this is wonderful. And first off, let me just say some thanks. So to Richard and Beth and the whole organizing committee, thanks ever so much. I was just saying to them at the entrance, this is the most progressive stats conference to be in an art gallery. So I'm very impressed, yes. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Professor Andrew Copas. So he'll talk to us about Estimands and cluster-randomized trials, and very importantly, choosing analyses that answer the right question. So I'll do the 2-minute warning from here as well. I've been turning over to the slide. Do we maybe let's tell the gentleman to sort it out? Great. Okay.
All the slides. Is this you? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, just progress it. Yeah, sorry, with the arrows? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much. It's a privilege to be giving the first talk here. And this is joint work with Brennan, Fan, and Michael. And what I'm talking about today is largely covered in a recently published article in International Journal of Epidemiology, which I hope you'll be inspired to take a look at after this session. Okay, so just a quick overview. I'm going to talk about what is informative cluster size and how, when we have that, we can think of two possible estimands. Then I'll talk about the bias that we would experience when we apply our usual methods. I'll talk about how some methods I would recommend to use instead. And then some comments on planning analysis when informative cluster size either is or isn't expected. Okay, so here's just the introduction to what is informative cluster size in the context of cluster randomized trials. Well, imagine we have an outcome, trial arm T, cluster size N, and importantly, N varies. So informative cluster size basically means that the outcome depends on cluster size. And this includes the possibility that the treatment effect itself depends on N. In other words, there is an interaction between treatment and cluster size. Now, it's crucial to note that this is separate from the incomplete data problem. I'm talking about here N to be the size of the full cluster or perhaps proportional to it if a random sample is surveyed. And I'm not talking about N varying because of missing data. So in this simple hypothetical example, we have 6 clusters. In the first 3, the number of participants is only 10, and we have a treatment effect. Let's imagine it's a difference of 5. And then the other 3, we have much bigger clusters, 100 participants, but the treatment effect now is only 1. So this is an example of informative cluster size. Now, how might informative cluster size arise? Well, let's imagine clusters are hospitals. Think of the example I just showed. N is the number of patients with a certain condition diagnosed in the trial period. Let's imagine the intervention is a new training program for staff in how to manage the condition, and the control is just to continue with routine practice. Now, in that little example, we saw the treatment effect was large in small hospitals, but small, almost negligible, perhaps in big hospitals. How might this kind of thing arise? So we could imagine hospital factors. Perhaps the staff in the big hospital are better trained pre-trial. So for them, there's not much change when they get this program because they're already doing it right. Or it could be patient factors. Perhaps patients in big hospitals are less likely to comply with their treatment plan than in small. It could be due to socioeconomic differences. Now, when we do have informative cluster size, we can think of 2 target estimands, and this is already recognized. There is an existing literature on informative cluster size, and we can kind of think of inference at either the cluster or individual level, and those will generally differ if we have informative cluster size. So the first possibility, a participant average treatment effect. So this answers the question, how effective is the intervention for the average participant? And the alternative would be a cluster average treatment effect. How effective is the intervention for the average cluster? Now, if cluster size affects the outcome mean, but not the treatment effect, so in other words, there's no interaction, then these 2 estimands can be the same for collapsible effect measures like difference, but they'll still differ for the non-collapsibles like an odds ratio. On the other hand, if cluster size affects the treatment effect, there is an interaction, then the 2 estimands will differ for all the effect measures that we use. So just coming back to that small sort of hypothetical example where we have the 6 clusters, what are the 2 effects here? Well, the participant average effect, we need to sort of effectively weight it by the number of participants. So we have a sort of a weighting of 100 to 10, and we get 1.36. On the other hand, the cluster average effect, we treat the clusters the same, so it's a simple average of the 1 and 5. So we get 3. So does this matter? Well, it does matter because the standard analysis methods basically don't work under informative cluster size. And it's well known in this existing literature that the methods we typically apply, mixed effects models or GE with exchange or working correlation, they're biased in general for both those treatment effects under informative cluster size. Although they will be unbiased if the 2 effects coincide. So, for example, collapsible measure and no interaction. So they're not always different, but they will generally be. If you think about this intuitively, well, both of these standard methods we use, they weight individuals less in bigger clusters than small, but they still give more total weight to bigger clusters than small ones. And so that's not right. For our estimands, we need to either weight the individuals equally for participant average effect, or we want to weight the clusters equally for the cluster average effect. So in fact, the kind of methods we could use would be something like independence estimating equations, That will be straightforward for participant average effect, or we can weight these by the inverse of the cluster size if we do want a cluster average effect. And here's just a little example of the kind of bias we might see. So this is a simulation based on the little example that I showed, but now we've increased it to 30 clusters of the big size and 30 small ones. And the plot is of percent bias, that's the vertical axis. It's the plot of bias in the estimation of the participant average treatment effect. So you can see that the percentage bias is quite high, increasing with the ICC for both mixed effects models and GE. But the independence estimated equations, nice green flat line at zero bias, as we would expect. So I've explained that the standard methods will be biased. They'll be biased for both of the estimands. So what would we actually recommend? So I've just mentioned this, independence estimating equations as an individual level method, unweighted for participant average or weighted by 1/n for cluster average. So how would we actually go about implementing that? So we could think of using GE with an independence working correlation. I use Stata, so I'm going to give some Stata language here. You could think of just doing the cluster robust standard errors. That would be fine. You could use the survey commands if you like. You can use the p weights if you need to weight by 1/the cluster size. And these methods should all give the same point estimates, but perhaps slightly different variance estimators. Now, if you do want the cluster level inference, then we can analyze summary values, mean, proportion, whatever it might be, unweighted for the cluster average effect, or this time we need to weight by n for the participant average. And when we do this, we need to use a regression method with a suitable link function. So for example, if our effect measure is an odds ratio, and if pi hat is the proportion in cluster J, then we're fitting this logistic model at the bottom. So in Stata, we're going to need to use the GLM command for this, because this is not, we're not going to use the standard logistic command because we're not modeling 0 and 1 outcomes. We're modeling those proportions directly. Okay, so now really just some sort of comments on how we think we should go about dealing with trial design analysis if informative cluster size is considered possible at the start. So if we expect, just to state the obvious, if we expect a huge difference in treatment effects, like perhaps we saw in the little example, of course, we're not just going to ignore that at the start. We may well want to stratify the trial and the analysis, and we may well recommend the intervention only for some hospital sizes. So of course, if we're talking about huge differences, then maybe we're thinking of this from the start. Similarly, we might stratify by something else. If we thought that actually the reason we saw those differences between small and large hospitals is actually because of patient age, nothing to do with the hospitals themselves, then we might stratify by that. And if we're certain of no interaction with size, we could simply adjust for n in our models. That kind of removes the informative cluster size, and we can apply standard methods. But I think, I'd argue we're often not sure that of no interaction. That's quite an extreme assumption. So where differences are possible, but big differences are not expected a priori, then I think a single treatment effect is likely meaningful, and we can pre-specify whether it will be the cluster or participant average, and then use a method that's robust to informative cluster size. Now, perhaps a bit more tricky. What about if informative cluster size is not really expected? So it's important to note that if informative cluster size does not arise, then the standard analysis methods that we tend to use, they're going to be unbiased. So in pre-specifying what we're going to do, we're making a trade-off. We've got the risk of bias from the standard methods if informative cluster size does arise, against the loss of efficiency from using independence estimating equations when not needed. And the loss of efficiency can be quantified. So Fan and colleague have written a paper from 2021. They showed that the loss of efficiency from using independence estimating equations depends on the ICC and the coefficient of variation in cluster size. And my take home from looking at the figures in their paper is that the loss of efficiency is likely minimal if the ICC is less than 0.02 or the coefficient of variation is less than 0.4 as a sort of rule of thumb. Now, unfortunately, then, it's when the cluster sizes then are most variable that we're in trouble, because that's both probably when the standard methods are going to be more biased, but also we're going to lose most efficiency by switching to the independence estimate equations. So variable cluster sizes are a problem. So further work then. So I think we are looking at methods to estimate conditional Estimands. I mean, for example, sort of cluster-specific effects that we typically get from mixed effects models. We're looking into how to do that. So I think we do know how to do it, in contrast to the marginal Estimands. So I've only shown marginal Estimands here. We still need to investigate method performance when the number of clusters is small. We need to look into sample size methods when we know we're going to use analysis methods robust to informative cluster size. Of course, all this needs to ultimately be extended to longitudinal designs like cluster crossover. And of course, this is an exciting opportunity for a PhD student to contribute. I don't know if there's anyone in the room or someone they know on the TMRP doctoral program. So to conclude, it's clear informative cluster size will be plausible for some trials, but I think as yet it's unclear if this is a frequent issue in practice. The impact will be greater if the ICC is higher and the cluster sizes are more variable. We all know it's best practice to specify an analysis method before starting analysis, in fact, before designing the trial. So we need to trade off risk of bias against efficiency loss. Now, there are alternatives such as, I guess, you could specify a standard method as your main analysis, and then you could have a sort of a nice, yes, robust sensitivity. I guess that might sound attractive. Or you could think of a two-stage process. I'm going to test for informative cluster size, and then I'll decide what method to use. But I think you can see that both of those are kind of problematic, not ideal. I think participant average effects are more relevant in general. In fact, personally, I can't think of any scenario to use a cluster average effect, but I don't know if my colleagues agree with me. But whichever one you're going to do, you need to pre-specify as part of the Estimand. And I think to conclude, it's important to consider informative cluster size at design for all trials, even if only to justify why it's not expected, and hence why standard analysis and design methods are suitable. I've got some references there to what I've been talking about. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was wonderful. So, and we have a few minutes for questions, have you said? So I'm coming up just to help with the questions. So perhaps we should first ask if those of our colleagues who've joined on Zoom, if there are any questions from them. There's no questions right now? Okay, so let me turn it over to our audience members. Okay, I do see hands up. Oh, here we've already got the mic down there. Let's go ahead, please. And I'll keep my eye on the time. Oh, great.
Is this on? Yes,
I can hear you.
I haven't really thought about this a great deal, but I'm just wondering in what scenarios one could possibly recommend reducing the variability in cluster size so that the problem that you've got is lessened. You didn't say anything about that. No,
I didn't. I sort of skirted that at the start, saying that the size of the cluster is the cluster size. Now, and it's occurred to me that I have myself in trials, I have encouraged people to collect roughly the same number of measurements in all clusters, even though some of the different size. But I think actually that's not a solution to the problem. The two Estimands are still going to be different in that scenario. You need to know which one you're estimating and not. Unfortunately, I don't think you can sweep it under the carpet by just getting people to collect more in the small ones and less in the big ones.
Now, I know we had a question from Andrew. Yeah. Thank you.
Just in response to that question, I think you need to consider a selection mechanism for the cluster size. So there's the real cluster size and then there's the observed cluster size somehow, just in response to that question. Well, thanks for throwing the cat amongst the pigeons for all the people working on correlation structures. And just one comment for longitudinal cluster trials. You mentioned about cluster crossover, step wedge in particular. The efficiency loss would be massive by you'd be only using vertical comparisons in the step wedge design. And whether there are some other approach, I don't know, the sort of targeted maximum likelihood stuff, or there's augmented estimating equations type things to try and recover efficiency from using, recover the inefficiency from using independence equations. Is anyone looking at areas like that?
I know I'm not. It's very interesting.
I
And I think we need
know
to.
Fan gave it.
I don't know. Yes,
Fan
maybe
gave a
Fan.
talk, which I
Yeah.
missed, unfortunately. I don't know whether he covered.
Yes, I mean, fans talk, yes, about when the mixed models are appropriate. Yeah, that is kind of getting at that. But yes, you're right. I think it's clearly important. I don't think we want to, we're hoping there is another method for, the longitudinal designs.
So this is wonderful because we're right at time. Thank you ever so much, Andrew. And now we have another Andrew Forbes, to speak with us on multiple treatment factorial cluster randomized crossover trials using incomplete block row column design. Good segue from your question. Yeah. Oh, and can we have some help, please, with the next? Or should we go ahead ourselves?
So we change this. There's nothing more terrifying than being told everything's running on time. Yep, that's it. Okay, lovely to be here after a few years away from COVID impact. First thing I want to do here is this disgusting title. I'm going to change the title actually. The more ambitious cluster-randomized crossover trial designs. That was a disgusting title. So this is joint work with Reuben Ogollah and Jessica Kasza, work with me at Monash. And we've got a group of 7, soon to be 8, which we call the Monash cluster of randomized trial researchers. Actually, 5 of us are here today, so you'll be hearing quite a lot from the cluster. Okay, outline what I'll talk about. I'll start off with the motivation for this, the intensive care setting. And when patients go into intensive care, almost all patients receive a lot of routine interventions for their safety and being monitored. So I'll talk about that as a setting for sort of an ambitious cluster crossover trial. But I want to gear up to this more complex with that disgusting title is the final point. I'll start off with the beginning parts of what a cluster crossover design actually is and give some conclusions, whether it's ready for implementation or whether there's more stuff still needs to be done. We're assuming equal cluster sizes. There's no variability, Andrew. So in intensive care, you've got a patient, they receive some interventions for their ventilation, but I'll focus on either electrolyte balance or nutrition intake with magnesium, phosphate, thiamine, protein, vitamin C, or various combinations of them. They can be administered intravenously or via a nasogastric tube. And these are all interventions that have been studied either together or in combination, and results are still all over the place. So that's the motivational for all of this work. So beginning cluster crossover designs, the simplest form is clusters randomized to either receive A and then B or B and then A. And the advantage of this is you can estimate the intervention effects within clusters, and that is much more precise. So first extension is to multiple period designs. Instead of a single crossover, you can have 2 crossovers, and that typically reduces number of clusters that are needed. Next extension is to, instead of a treatment with just 2 levels, you can have a treatment with 4 levels. For example, nutrition at 4 different kilojoules energy intake there. So we can have a design with, say, 4 clusters and 4 periods, a nice square design. And these can be classed as row column designs in the experimental design literature, where the rows are clusters and the columns are periods. And important here in the intensive care setting, we don't have to worry about carryover effects. That's a bit for another talk, but it's very unlikely that there are carryover effects at cluster level for these sorts of interventions. So the types of classical experimental designs in this 4x4 setting are Latin squares and various variants of it. And it's got nice statistical properties about treatments being essentially uncorrelated with clusters and periods. We can then, instead of having a treatment at 4 levels, I use exactly the same design to consider a 2x2 factorial experiment where we've got two factors A and B, each at levels called on and off. The red symbol, if you can see the red, probably, yeah, the red means on, and the black symbol means off. And so there's sort of four combinations of on or off across the two factors A and B. This is exactly the same as the previous slide, so we can use the same Latin squared design. So the question here is, why do we stop at two treatments? So this comes to a conversation I had with an intensive care physician. This was pre-COVID, it really got derailed by COVID, but he's interested in talking about it now. These are the 5 factors I talked about previously. So can we study all of these in combination with each other? Can we do a 2 to the 5 factorial experiment? So there's 2 to the power of 5 is 32. So there are 32 different treatment combinations, but we can't use cluster crossover trial with 32 treatment periods. So the question is now, what sort of design can we use? So the aims are to find a design that can estimate the main effects of each of the 5 interventions efficiently as possible, and it's by using within cluster comparisons to remove the cluster effect. And because there have been some trials of combinations of these therapies, we want to be able to estimate 2-factor interactions as efficiently as possible, as many as possible using within cluster comparisons. Not so interested in higher order interactions. And we don't want 32 periods at all, and the target was 4 periods rather than 32. So this is where this potential design comes in, this horrible name, incomplete block row column cyclic design. This has been used in agricultural trials for, it's actually more close to 40 years, not in the cluster setting. There's even a book that's relevant to cluster crossover work called Experimental Design and Analysis for Tree Improvement. So we're going from horticulture to intensive care with the same sort of designs. So instead of 32 periods per cluster, we're going to have 4 periods per cluster. So that's why it's called an incomplete design. And not all the 2-factor interactions are estimable within clusters, and there's certain fairly complicated formulas to work out how many 2-factor interactions are going to be estimable for a different type of design. But the design works in combinations that are called bricks of 32 cluster periods, 8 clusters and 4 periods. So we've got 32 cluster period cells, and that covers all 32 combinations of treatment. There are lots of different ways to order these sorts of designs. So we need software to search for the best ones. And then the power calculations say, well, how are we going for time? Good. How many bricks of 8 clusters are needed? So sample sizes in terms of these bricks. So here's a sample allocation for one cluster. I'll just try and use the mouse here. Yeah, so this bottom left-hand corner thing, that's a cluster number 1 in the first period. They receive either on or off levels of the 5 interventions. So A, B, C, and E are on and D is off. In the second period, A, B, D, and E are on and C is off. So that's the kind of design that's going to be generated. So the software used is called Cyc Design for cyclic designs. And unfortunately, this is commercial software with an annual license. So I would love not to have to use this. But anyway, that's all I've found at the moment that can do these sorts of designs. So you tell it you want a 2 to the 5 factorial design, 4 periods per cluster, and here I've asked it for 3 bricks of 8 clusters, and it goes through an algorithm to search for the most efficient design, and it's prioritized so that all main effects are estimable fully within clusters. So this is the horrible looking thing full of 1s and 2s. The 1s mean essentially on, and the 2s mean off. So let's look at what sort of things happen with these designs. So this is just for the first brick, the first 8 clusters. That's 8 clusters and 4 periods. Let's look at the A-B interaction. So in the first cluster, the A-B interaction has A and B both on in the first period and the second period, and A and B both off in the third and fourth period. So we can't estimate the A-B interaction within cluster number 1. But we can do it within cluster number 5. There's all 4 combinations of the A's and B's. So the first thing is that for these incomplete designs, not all clusters are going to be able to estimate A-B interaction within cluster. So some are going to be within clusters, some between clusters. And actually that could relate to something Andrew's. I have to think about that anyway. So it means the efficiency of the A-B interaction is less than 1. Let's just take another interaction, the CD interaction, looking at cluster number 8. It's got all four combinations of the 2s and 1s, so that's estimable within cluster. And that's the same across all clusters as well. So the CD interaction is estimated fully within clusters. So this has really important design implications for looking at this 5-factor trial. So if the investigators are interested in interaction between 2 specific factors, they can know from the design which elements essentially to call them. So if they're interested in interaction, they might call them factors C and D. Other factors where they're not interested in interaction be called A and B. That's probably a little too simplistic in practice, but at least it's sort of starting point. So for sample size and power, we need to set up a model without informative cluster sizes here. Don't have to worry about it. So we're going to have, thanks Liz, yeah, a nested or block exchangeable correlation model. I'm just using for example here. So that's a model where the correlation between subjects within the same cluster, but in the same period, is higher than the correlation between 2 subjects in different periods. So that's about as mathematical as this is going to get. And then you can generate this correlation structure with a linear mixed model with random effects for cluster and cluster period. So here's an example of some power curves. Just drawn 3 curves here. There's lots of these that could be done. You actually don't have to worry about the particular configuration. I just want to focus on the patterns here. So the blue line is the power to detect main effects of say some size delta, and the power for main effects, that's for each of the 5 main effects, is the same as if they were conducted in their own trial. So you really get sort of 5 for the price of 1 there in the absence of interactions. When you are interested in interactions, the power varies drastically depending on whether interaction is estimated fully within cluster or only partially within cluster, partially between clusters. So the red line is interactions, the CD interactions fully within clusters. So these designs can be relatively useful for detecting certain interactions, but others not. So there's not going to be a design that can do everything. There are going to be some trade-offs, and the trade-offs are some interactions are not going to be estimated precisely. So in conclusion then, so factorial designs are possible in a few periods. Interactions require careful planning, but we can know about this at the design stage. And because these designs are done in bricks, you can do an assessment, essentially an interim analysis after each brick, and look at whether you want to drop treatments, various sorts of other adaptations. And if you think adaptive trials are new, these were suggested in the agricultural literature. I think I found a reference like 40 years ago, where they talk about doing these things and dropping treatments, sort of a screening process at the first stage. And it's like a lot of these complex platform trials that are happening at the moment. It's not quite ready for a real trial, and some comments here. So I've used cyclic designs. I haven't found any other software that can generate the sorts of designs that are needed. There are other alternatives in the literature, mainly the agricultural literature, and sometimes they can be more efficient for interactions. Need to consider binary outcomes, very common, and marginal modeling approach, other correlation structures like exponential decay. And if anyone can find some free software, that would be really appreciated. A token of appreciation will be provided for that. So the end result of this, that complex trials in principle are possible, even 5 factors over 4 periods. And next step is actually to do one. So thank you.
Perfectly timed. And we have a few minutes again for questions. It's quite tricky with this, like,
Yeah.
here we go. Do we have any online, please? No? Okay, so please, let's open it up to members who are colleagues who are here now. What questions do we have? Yes, please. Do we have the mic, please? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, just perhaps a point of clarification. The software you use, the commercial one you mentioned at the end, the exponential correlation and things. Does that software take into account that correlation structure?
No, it has got a spatial correlation structure, but that's at the individual error level. This exponential decay correlation, as we'll see in other talks here, is at the cluster, sort of at the cluster period level.
Yeah, we did a bit of work on like optimal designs and algorithms for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the optimal design strongly depends on the parameters you choose and that covariance. So I wondered if you've been able to account for that at all in the way you were looking at choosing what was the optimal combination of treatments.
All the covariance structure is simply the block exchangeable, and that makes life much easier. And that comes from the row column design. So in the row column design in the agricultural area, the rows are fixed effects. And then so you can't actually sort of get any information about interaction effects between clusters, but by incorporating the random effects for cluster and cluster period, you can obtain sort of half the interaction in one cluster and half in another cluster. But it's true with any sort of the correlation structure is critical to how the optimality of any design.
All right, thank you.
Maybe we can chat some more after.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Now, any other questions? What other questions do we have in the audience? Oh, here. Oh, both of the speakers have questions, please.
No, just a very quick question. You mentioned in agricultural, it was not in cluster trials typically, but because I was surprised. I would have thought everything in agricultural would be done kind of.
It's in sort of seed lots that you'd have in each cluster period cell that'd be individual seeds and plants, individual.
So that overall measure and not tree level measure sort of.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks. And I was just wondering whether the bricks that you had, those of size 8, is that an artifact of the software or of using these cyclic designs? I mean, presumably it's not, you don't have to have.
Yeah, so the idea of these cyclic designs is to have all factorial combinations within a brick. So in principle, you can, well, not all up to 5 factor interactions are estimable, but many of them will be. And then you just sort of stack the bricks together to form the whole design. And that's part of the name of the design is resolvable. Resolvable means you can get all factorial combinations in a brick, basically. There's so much terminology with these things.
That has brought us perfectly to the allotted time for questions. Thank you ever so much, Andrew. Let's thank Andrew again. Perhaps I'll introduce whilst that's okay. I hope that maybe I'll move this here. Thanks ever so much. So our next speaker is Dr. Baptiste Leurent from London School of Hygiene. UCL, that's what I thought. Both, from both. So Baptiste will talk to us about handling missing baseline covariate data in cluster randomized trials. And we will, thank you ever so much. Thank you, Baptiste. I'm showing it to you after 10 minutes.
Great. Right, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to speak about the handling of missing baseline covariates in cluster randomized trials. This is a joint work with Baptiste Leurent, Jennifer Thompson, Richard Hooper, Ellen Bice, and Lisa Lennon. So adjustment for baseline covariates is recommended in trials. You can gain in power and you can control for imbalance between your arms. But baseline covariates are not always fully observed. And there's no clear guidance on how best to handle baseline covariates if they are not completely observed in cluster randomized trials. So the aim of this work was to assess the performance of different methods to handle missing baseline covariates in cluster randomized trials using simulations. So I'm going to first introduce the methods, how we did our simulation, how we generated the data, which adjustment methods we compared, and how we assessed the performance of the different methods. So just to give a brief overview of our simulations, so we try to reproduce a cluster randomized trial with a cohort follow-up. We have a continuous outcome, which is normally distributed, and a variable at baseline, which is similar to the follow-up outcome, but which has some missing observation. And it's going to be missing completely at random. We're going to play with different cluster size, with different ICCs, with different subject and cluster autocorrelations, and different proportion of missing data. So our data generating mechanism, we created two correlated variables by so-called YIJT. So Y is for individual, J is a cluster, and T is a time, so 0 at baseline and 1 at follow-up. So we've got, I'm going to try to use a pointer, we've got a treatment effect, which is assumed to be fixed. So again, we don't go into the informative cluster size at all. We have a simple treatment effect for the cluster that received the treatment. We have a random effect by clusters, and we have additional residual at the subject level. And we're going to create our two correlated variables by drawing some correlated random effect at the cluster level and at the subject level. And then in the second step, we're going to create our missing data at baseline, drawing missing completely at random data. So the different parameters we are going to vary. So we first assume a base case scenario, which is supposed to be representative of a typical school-based trial, which was our primary interest when we started this work. So we've got 60 clusters in the trial, so 30 per arms, an average cluster size of 40, ICC of 0.05, and cluster and subject autocorrelation of 0.60. And then we look at two other more extreme scenarios, one with small clusters and small ICC, one with large clusters and large ICC. And then we vary all the combinations of parameter at the end. And one thing to note is that we kept the number of clusters at 60. This is because it shouldn't be really related to the performance of the different adjustment methods. And it's just not to go too much into the issues of estimating standard errors with few clusters. So the baseline adjustments methods we're going to compare. First, we have either we don't adjust for baseline, so we're going to analyze this Y1 variable like that, ignoring this one. Another approach would be to use a complete case analysis. So we're going to discard all the ones that are missing at baseline. Another approach would be to use a mean imputation. So we're going to just replace these missing values by a single imputation. And we could either use, that's an approach that's been shown to work well in individually randomized trials. So we wonder if it's going to work similarly here. And we could either use the overall mean from all our observed data in the whole trial, or we could replace by the mean at the cluster level. Another approach would be to use a repeated measure model or constrained baseline model. So the idea is that you fit a joint model for your two variables. You fit a bivariate model that's going to treat your data as repeated measures. And so for all of these methods, we're going to try either we just adjust for the individual level covariate, or we're going to also adjust for the cluster level mean. So you can see that easily you could try to adjust for that, but also you could derive the cluster level mean at baseline, and in addition, adjust for that as an extra covariate. So that's going to make 10 methods that we want to compare. So in terms of performance, we're going to look at, we simulated data in Stata. We simulated 1,000 datasets for each scenario. And we're going to estimate beta. I forgot to say that's our estimate of interest. We want to estimate the treatment effect. So we're going to estimate it using a random effect model and adjust it for baseline using the different methods we introduced before. So for each scenario and methods, we're going to look at the bias, the confidence interval coverage, the average model-based standard error. So that's your standard error reported by your model, and the empirical standard error. So that's how your point estimate vary from one simulation to another. So it's a more accurate estimation of your true sampling distribution variance. And the key criteria of interest here is what we call the relative efficiency, which is the empirical variance of that given method relative to the empirical variance of the unadjusted analysis as a reference. So that's going to give us how much more efficient it is to use that method compared to unadjusted analysis. So now looking at the results, so we found that all methods were unbiased, probably as expected. We found that the model-based standard errors were mostly correct, but we noticed that there was a slight underestimate if we don't use a small sample corrections. Even if we had 60 clusters in total, I thought that would be fine to ignore the small sample corrections, but we still have a small under coverage of the standard errors. So it's good to always use a small sample correction. We also noticed an overestimate for one specific method if you're just going to adjust for the cluster level mean. And if you have a very low ICC, then it's going to struggle to estimate your standard error and it's going to overestimate them. And this has been discussed elsewhere. There's been a few papers I noticed that, and there's different ways this can be addressed by changing a bit your analysis model. So now that we saw that all methods were unbiased, we're going to look at the empirical variance and which method is more efficient. Okay, they're all unbiased. Now we want to choose the most efficient method. So now let's first look at what's the effect of adjusting for the baseline cluster level mean. Okay, so we have here on the vertical axis is the efficiency. So the lower, the better. On the vertical axis, the proportion of missing data. And the three columns are three different scenarios. And we've got 5 rows which represent the 5 family of methods. So first is a complete as unadjusted, then the complete case, then the mean imputation, then the repeated measure model in the last row. And we can see that when we adjust for the cluster level mean, we always reduce so we increase the efficiency, okay, by adjusting for the cluster level mean. Sometimes the benefit's going to be negligible. Here, it's very similar whether you adjust or not for the cluster level mean. And sometimes you will have quite a good benefit. So except for the repeated measure model where actually you don't need to adjust for the cluster level mean, that's automatically handled in your model. So a summary of this is that it's always a good idea to adjust for the cluster level mean. And now we're going to focus, instead of these 10 methods, we're going to reduce on the 5 that are adjusted for the cluster level mean. So if you look at the efficiency in our 3 main scenarios, we can see that in green here, complete case is usually not a good idea. That you can have a low, worse efficiency than an unadjusted analysis, which is a line at 1 here. And all the other methods perform similarly, either in the base case or in the large clusters scenario. When you've got a small cluster and small ICC, there is more of a difference. You can see that the repeated measure model is going to be more efficient than the 3 other methods which are mean imputation or just adjusting for the cluster level mean. So now if you look at all our scenarios, so we we looked at 72 different scenarios playing with the different parameters. I'm just showing here for the first 12. So that's with a small cluster size. And so that's the efficiency for the different methods. And we can see that either the cluster level mean, you just adjust for the cluster level mean without trying to adjust for the individual level values, or you do overall mean imputation, or you do cluster level mean imputation. All these methods are performing okay. And the repeated measure model is sometimes performing very similarly to the other approach, and sometimes is a bit more efficient, particularly if you have a low ICC and a high subject autocorrelation, okay? And the complete case is usually to be avoided. It's, as I said before, it's can have sometimes worse efficiencies than an adjusted method. So to summarize our findings, so we found that repeated measure models usually perform best. It can efficiently handle the missing baseline covariates. Or otherwise only adjusting for the cluster level mean. So you just add your cluster level mean in your model, or doing a mean imputation and adjusting for both the individual level values imputed and the cluster level mean performs satisfactorily. And they are much easier than there's a few issues with the repeated measure model. It's a bit trickier to fit. So that's alternatives that are much easier with sometimes at the cost of efficiency. Just to remind that mixed model standard errors can be incorrect, particularly if you have few clusters, or with one of the methods if you have a low ICC. But the question is, so that's just a very simple situation. We are missing completely at random. So question is, does that going to hold in other situations? So we want to explore this further. What if you have missing at random or missing not at random? What if you have a varying treatment effect? What if you have other covariates? So there's lots of other questions we could explore further. But based on the current simulations, our conclusions would be, our recommendation would probably be to always adjust for the cluster level mean. There is very little cost to that, and it's always going to be more efficient. Repeated measure model can handle the missing data very naturally, so it should probably be the preferred approach if when possible, especially if you're going to analyze multiple follow-up. But otherwise, you could use simpler alternative like mean imputation. But we just want to say also that baseline adjustment in cluster randomized trial is not straightforward, and further research is probably still required. And just a few references to finish with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Baptiste. Perfectly on time as well. And we just have a few more minutes. So I think we'll again ask if, are there any questions from, okay. So now let's turn it over to the room and we have the mic. Oh yes, I see. Please near the back there. Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering the results you see where there are bigger differences when there's a higher proportion missing. Do you know, is that, if that's roughly continuous just as you're missing more observations, or does something qualitatively change when you start missing the baseline values for entire clusters?
So one thing to highlight, there was no clusters with full missing. There was always some observation for each clusters. I didn't go into the, if it's totally missing, which I don't know, I would handle maybe just a mean imputation, or the overall mean imputation may perform well, but I haven't explored that. So there's kind of not necessarily linear, but typically used to be the more missing data, the worst off. Yeah.
Thank you.
Elise, I saw another hand. Was there another hand towards the back? Oh, the same question. And anybody? Oh, here for John.
Hi, Baptiste. Maybe this is a tangent, so you might be able to have much to say, but another situation where we use baseline data is for randomization, for restricted randomization. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on what you might do if you've got missing baseline data in that situation.
Well, I guess you couldn't randomize the, if you, like you need them. I think if it's stratified or minimized, I guess you need them at baseline. So which wouldn't be applicable. I thought more if you have a cluster level, that's quite. I'm used to that. You may have cluster level covariates that you adjust for, and this you need them to randomize. But yeah, if it's missing, I don't know if anyone ever done. Could you do minimization if it's missing? Find some ways to.
You could impute in the same way.
Yeah, maybe point if you want to minimize on that factor, how could you, if in case it's missing, maybe a mean imputation would be okay. So it's just like you can still assign your patients and you just feed it by any random value kind of. I think that would work well.
So we are pretty much at time. I think everybody's probably ready for some tea here, and maybe those online, especially those who've joined from overseas and it's possibly the middle of the night for you. We hope that you can go have a little break as well. Thank you for joining us online, and thanks to our speakers. This has been a really wonderful session and I have a lot more questions for everybody. Thank you.
In the multivariable model, this can result in convergence issues. And so to think about how likely this problem is, in the CRT literature, typically at least 40 clusters are recommended in order to obtain valid inference. However, reviews of trials have found median numbers of 21, 25, and 36 clusters, suggesting that the majority of CRTs may not be reaching that number of clusters. And so we just want to indicate that we'll be using the GE framework for estimation and inference. And so this slide is just to set up some notation and furthermore indicate that we are interested in a marginal treatment effect, which can be obtained from the GE. And then here we have the robust sandwich estimator which despite misspecification of the working structure can still provide valid inference. In the setting in which there is a small number of clustering units, this residual product tends to underestimate the actual variability in the outcome. And so in the literature, there have been many bias corrections that have been proposed. And so here I just have a list of them. In particular, a factor is included in that sandwich estimator in order to inflate the standard error to appropriate values. And while previous studies have compared these different bias-corrected estimators, they did focus on either the unadjusted analysis or the cluster-level covariate adjustment. And furthermore, in these simulation studies, performance tended to depend on the particular settings of interest. And so in our study, we wanted to provide some new numerical evidence looking at individual level baseline covariates and its performance in terms when the goal is to estimate this participant average treatment effect on the odds ratio scale, which is our target estimate in this case. So just to go over the objectives of the study, we are interested in seeing how well a new estimator that incorporates propensity score weights, how it performs when looking at this particular challenging setting. So we will be comparing the PS rating with the typical regression adjustment using GEE. And so we conducted a simulation study looking at a varying range of parameter values in order to understand in order to answer three questions. The first is, does individual level covariate adjustment provide efficiency gains? Are the bias corrections sufficient in this in the setting of interest? And when do models break down? And so with when using propensity scores, there are a few decisions that have to be made. In particular, how are the propensity score values estimated? So in our study, we considered two types of models. The first is the standard logistic regression, and then this non-parametric model called the Bayesian additive regression trees, or BART model, which is quite popular in the causal inference area. We define WI to be a diagonal matrix of weights, and then with weighting, there are also decisions that need to be made, in particular, the choice of weights. In this case, we consider the inverse probability weights and then the overlap weights. So this table here just shows our contribution to this problem where we incorporate this propensity score weighting matrix in the bias corrections that have been seen in the literature. We focus on the MD, KC, and FG estimators, as these have been the more popular ones, and in previous simulation studies have been compared and shown to perform well in certain cases. And then on the bottom part, we indicate for the multivariable model, especially when adjusting for covariates, depending on how you go about with the inference, it can differ by the whether you're interested in a conditional or marginal effect. And so using a delta method, we had obtained this M matrix, which the expression we show in our paper. So for the simulation study, we compared a variety of we looked at a wide range of parameters, and for purposes of showing results here, we focused on what we call the very low incidence case, where outcome incidences are around 0.025 and 0.05 for the treatment and control arms, respectively. And so outcome generated models, the first two are the linear, incorporate linear additive effects, with the second outcome generating model including strong associations between covariates and outcome. And then we have two outcome generating, and then the last two outcome generating models have nonlinear terms as well as treatment heterogeneity. And so one of the things we wanted to look at was how well adjusting for covariates can improve efficiency. So these are the results from the 4 different outcome generating models. In particular, it appears that when covariates are related to the outcome, the multivariable model and PS weighting models give higher efficiency over the unadjusted or crude model. And what's interesting here is that in certain scenarios, especially when the data generated model is complex, the propensity score weighting using the bar approach, non-parametric approach, tends to do better than the logistic, the parametric logistic regression that might be misspecifying the relationship. And then with coverage, we wanted to see how well the bias corrections can inflate the standard error to appropriate values. And so the interval here, as shown by the dotted lines, indicates nominal coverage. And so in general, the MD correction tends to be giving coverage that is closest to nominal across the number of clusters. And especially when the number of clusters is very low at 6, we see that MD is doing the best in terms of performance in this aspect. And then this table here just shows a few the non-convergence proportions, which are the percentages of replications that resulted in an error. And so for 6 clusters with a mean cluster size of 6 and 6 covariates, we see that the multivariable model tends to give higher non-convergence rates than the other approaches. And especially when the number of covariates goes from 6 to 15, we saw that the non-convergence proportions tend to be much higher. So in a lot of cases, the multivariable model was not converging. So to wrap up, individual level covariate adjustment provides efficiency gains over the unadjusted model, especially when covariates are prognostic, and flexible modeling using non-parametric models of the propensity score may perform better when the data settings are more complex. We saw that the MD bias correction sandwich variance estimator in these settings tended to give the best performance in terms of coverage. And so essentially the simulation study informed us, and we would like to recommend that propensity score weighting along with the standard error bias corrections in this setting of a rare binary outcome and a small number of clusters can be a practical approach. And so thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and further details about our study may be found on the archive, which we posted our paper. Thank you. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, I'll start my presentation. My name is Reuben Ogollah, and I'll be presenting on behalf of Lucy Bradshaw, who is in the program, and the rest of the GBS3 team. So my presentation is mainly a case study, and we'll be sharing some of the methodological challenges that we've observed in one of our ongoing cluster randomized clinical trial called GBS3. So I'll start briefly by giving the background to the GBS3 trial. Group B strep, or GBS, is a bacterium present in the lower gut and genital tract of approximately 1 in 4 pregnant women. And approximately 50% of babies whose mothers are GBS carriers will also become colonized with GBS during the pregnancy or during the labor. Of those babies, 3% will develop early onset GBS or GBS disease. So the objective of GBS3 trial was to test whether routine testing of women for GBS colonization, either in the late pregnancy or during labor, reduces the occurrence of early onset neonatal sepsis compared to the current risk factor-based strategy. So in the trial, we are including all women with vaginal delivery or trial of labor or pre-labor rupture membrane at least 24 weeks gestation. And the intervention is the routine testing of women for GBS colonization using either antenatal enriched culture medium, or which I'll be calling ECM in this presentation, at 35 to 37 weeks gestation, or the intrapartum rapid testing at least 37 weeks gestation using rapid molecular tests. Any woman who becomes positive is offered the intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis. The control is the maternal risk factor-based strategy, which is the usual care. And any woman who is found to be at high risk is also offered the IAP. The primary outcome is the all-cause early onset neonatal sepsis, which is determined by either culture positive or clinically suspected sepsis. which is determined as negative or unknown culture status with at least 3 agreed clinical signs or symptoms for which the antibiotics are given for at least 5 days, starting within 7 days of birth. So because the outcome is a very rare binary outcome, the sample size is very large, individual 320 women, but our unit of randomization is the NHS trust or individual maternity units, if not, or individual maternity units. And we plan to randomize the 80 trusts, minimized by the number of deliveries, neonatal units, level of care, and presence of alongside midwifery units into either the usual care, which is the risk factor base, or the routine testing. Trusts which are randomized to routine testing are further randomized to either perform the enriched culture, medium is or the CM, or the rapid tests. All the primary and all secondary outcomes are derived from routine sources, and the adjudication of clinically suspected sepsis is done on a subset of the sample. The process outcomes and the sub-randomization comparison outcomes are derived from detailed data collection on a subset of women in each cluster. And because we are using routine data sources, no written informed consent is obtained from participation in the main trial. We've encountered a number of challenges, and one of them, which is the main one, is the longer waiting times for intervention implementation due to logistical challenges and the effect of COVID-19. So as you can see, just an example of 22 sites that have been given green light to open. The mean number of days from randomization to the start of data collection is approximately 151 days in the risk factor site, but much larger, 311 in the routine testing sites, and even quite large within the 365 days within the rapid test sites. As a result of this, the data collection from risk factor site, if we just went with the design as we planned, would have started at an earlier time frame than the intervention site. So as you can see, as of October 2021, we would only be comparing the risk factor sites to nothing, and the testing sites are coming in from January 2022. So as a result of that, we decided to extend the data collection. Of course, that involves a lot of negotiations with the sites. In the routine, for the risk factor sites that are already open, and delay the opening of sites that were randomized to risk factor until more intervention sites are ready for opening. And going forward from now, all the sites that are randomized at the same time to be opened and to be open to data collection at the same time. This is mainly to ensure that the data used for comparison of the two strategies is contemporaneous. We've encountered lots of other challenges, but because of time, I'll just mention one of them being not being able to recruit the target number of sites. Our target was 80, and due to a lot of problems like the randomization barriers, including the excess treatment costs, capacity concerns, the replication of excess treatment cost negotiations in Scotland and Wales, and the problems of adoption of ECM by microbiology, we've only managed to, we are anticipating to recruit 60 sites. That is the realistic number of NHS trusts that we are able to recruit. We anticipate that this will not have much effect on our power and the sample size, because we will extend the data collection period, which will just imply that we'll have larger average cluster sizes as opposed to what we anticipated at the beginning. In summary, despite adequate planning, especially in this trial where we had got a team, there's a number of team members were involved in a similar trial, GBS2, we are still facing several unanticipated challenges, and our proposed solutions here are only possible because we are using the routinely collected health data, but careful consideration need to be taken into account when directly collecting individual patients' level data. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you very much, Reuben. We've got plenty of time for questions this time, so particularly encourage questions from those online. But if not, people in the room.
Thank you. This is Richard Hooper from Queen Mary University of London. You mentioned that you will tackle the lower than expected number of clusters by recruiting more individuals per cluster. So have you done a sample size recalculation, reassessment, taking account of the clustering to do that?
Yeah, we have done that, and we are discussing with the DMC and TC in the next next week on the sample size estimation to take into account that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, so thank you very much, Reuben, for a very nice talk. So next we've got Jessica, who's going to give a live talk. She's going to talk about decaying correlation parameters.
Today, I am going to be talking about how we can obtain decaying correlation parameter values from previously analyzed cluster randomized trials. Hopefully what I'm talking about will become clear over the next few minutes. This is, of course, joint work with Reese and Andrew, also from the cluster at Monash, but we've also brought in Yongdong or Derek and Monica from Ottawa. Okay, so of course, we're all very familiar with standard cluster randomized trials here. We randomize our clusters to implement the intervention or the control condition. If we consider two participants from the same cluster, these two participants could be measured close together in time or further apart in time. It's all right, it's okay. I don't need to fix that. I can thank you. So these participants could be measured closer together in time or further apart in time, but we estimate generally we estimate a single intracluster correlation, an aggregate intracluster correlation, which describes the similarity of these participants aggregated over that entire time period. When we start thinking about the stepped wedge design and other longitudinal cluster randomized trials, we have an opportunity to think a little bit more about these within cluster correlation structures, a little bit more about these intracluster correlations. So now if we consider two participants from the same cluster, well, they could be measured in the same period of the study or in different periods of the study, differing amounts of time apart. We can now think a little bit more about whether the correlation between these pairs of individuals will remain constant. Will it be the same if they're measured in the same cluster in the same period, or will that depend on whether or not they're measured in different periods? Could that correlation decay over time? Well, this decaying correlation structure is something we talked about before, but in case you haven't, I'm going to go through it again just to make sure we're all on the same page with it. So let's suppose we've got a single cluster here. We've got 8 participants in this cluster. 2 of them are measured in each of 4 periods. So we're going to consider the correlation between our first participant and all of these other participants in this cluster. So the standard correlation assumption that we make is that these correlations are all exchangeable. So the correlation between any pair of participants is identical. So the correlation between participant 1 and participant 2, that's equal to rho. It's the same as the correlation between participant 1 and participant 8. We don't really care about the amount of time that's elapsed between the measurement of these individuals. We just estimate this single aggregate intracluster correlation. So this is a really convenient structure to deal with, but it may not always be realistic. So this is where the decaying correlation assumption comes in. So now we do suppose that the correlation between pairs of participants depends on whether or not they're measured in the same period or measured in different periods. So here the correlation between participant 1 and 2, since they're measured in the same period, is going to be equal to rho. But if we consider participant 1 and 3, for example, well, these two participants are measured 1 period apart. So we assume that that correlation has decayed a little bit in that time. So now we've got a correlation between these two participants, or between their outcomes, equal to some number R times rho, where this R describes, it's between 0 and 1. It's a number that describes how much this correlation has decayed. So just to make everything absolutely crystal clear, this is what's going on for these correlation structures. So for our exchangeable correlation structure, our within period intracluster correlation, so telling us what happens for two participants measured in the same cluster in the same period, is equal to that correlation between two participants measured in the same cluster but in different periods. For our discrete time decay, on the other hand, this correlation does depend on the amount of time that has elapsed between their measurement, the number of periods that has elapsed. So this RD parameter, which is, as I said before, between 0 and 1 generally, is referred to as the cluster autocorrelation. So for the discrete time decay model, we might have something like this. We might have an intracluster correlation of 0.035. This is typical in the sort of intensive care unit settings that Andrew spoke about earlier today. So we might have an intracluster correlation of 0.035 and a intracluster correlation of 0.035 and a cluster autocorrelation of 0.95. So then this means that if we've got two participants measured in the same cluster in the same period, their ICC is going to be 0.035. But as we move further apart in time, this correlation is going to reduce or decay. So if we're planning these studies, we need to get some idea of what these correlations look like. What do these parameters look like? If we're going to be planning a study, we need some idea of this. So how can we get estimates of the decay of these parameters? Well, you could analyze data that you already have. That's great. If you've got data from a similar setting, analyze that, get some idea of what's going on. You could use the cloud bank repository. And I did notice that one of our earlier speakers did already cite the cloud bank repository, which is the work of Lizzie Korovar, part of our cluster at Monash. So this is a repository of correlation parameters for 44 continuous outcomes from 29 longitudinal cluster randomized data sets, or cluster data sets, not all randomized. Or you could use estimates from previously published studies, even if decays were not estimated in those previously published studies. And I've got a wow here because I think this is pretty neat work, if I do say so myself. So why would we want to use these estimates from previously published studies? What's the point of that? Well, outside of the cloud bank, there are a few estimates of these decaying correlation parameters that are available. It's a relatively new within cluster correlation structure. It hasn't been used in the analysis of too many trials to date. But lots of studies have estimates for the exchangeable and the block exchangeable, a structure which I haven't mentioned. Lots of studies have estimates for the parameters from these sorts of models. And it turns out that we can use those estimates to get some idea about decaying correlation parameters. So that is, we can transform those estimates to give us some idea of these decaying correlation structures. So how do we do that? Well, let's suppose that the exchangeable model was incorrectly fit to the data set from a stepped wedge trial. Doesn't have to be a stepped wedge trial, but we'll go with that. We've then got an estimate of the intracluster correlation, rho hat E. So we can find values of these two parameters for the decaying correlation structure, the within the intracluster correlation and the cluster autocorrelation from that discrete time decay model that could give rise to this estimate. So what values of rho D and RD would give us an estimate of the exchangeable correlation parameter if we were to incorrectly analyze the data using that exchangeable structure? This is how you do it. So this slide is not very nice, but hopefully you can see that all we really have here is a polynomial in terms of RD. So what have we got? We've got T is our number of periods, K is our number of clusters, we've got M participants in each cluster in each period. We've shown that you can solve this equation. You plug in your K, your T, your M, you plug in your estimated value of your exchangeable ICC. You solve this for RD and rho D, and Bob's your uncle, you're done. You've got some values that will tell you what you need to know. So you could solve this. You could solve this approximation to that equation. When you look at this approximation, you really can see that it is a very simple polynomial that we're trying to solve here. There's nothing too complicated about that, really. It just doesn't look very nice. So let's consider this approach in practice. So we've got data from the Health Improvement Network database. We've got some measure of, I believe HbA1c is something to do with blood glucose, measured in a bunch of patients from 430 general practices over 12 months. We've got our estimate of our exchangeable correlation there, or our aggregate ICC. So we want to plan a stepped wedge trial in a similar group of patients. In this trial, our periods are going to be of length 3 months. So that tells us that this 12-month period, this 12-month duration has 4 3-month periods in it. We've got our K, we've got our M. We need to solve this equation. That's not too difficult to do. We could solve our approximation as well. And you can really see how close that approximation is to the original equation. And that's because we've got K multiplied by M being very large here. Thanks. Okay, so how would you solve this? You could solve this manually in R or Stata or wherever, but we've put together an app for you, so you don't need to solve that. You can go to the app, plug in all of your values, get your estimated, get your ICCs and CACs that you need. So of course, the eagle-eyed among you will have realized that we are solving one equation in 2 unknowns. So we're not going to get a single solution. We're instead going to get an entire range of solutions. So each pair of points on this plot will give you values that are consistent, where I'm not using consistency in the statistical term, the statistical manner here, will give you values of the ICC and the CAC that could give rise to that estimated estimated aggregate ICC that you saw before. So you still need to use some of your judgment about what values are appropriate, but you get some idea. Okay, so over the past few years, we've really come to an enhanced understanding of within cluster correlation structures for longitudinal cluster randomized trials. We've got models that allow for this correlation to decay over time. We've got this repository of estimates of correlation parameters. With this work, we have a way to obtain discrete time decay correlation parameter estimates from these simpler, more commonly used models. We've also got sample size calculators that allow for decaying correlations. And of course, I'll shout out Carla's Shiny CRT app. We've got some ideas about how to choose the best within cluster correlation structure. This is some work that Estimands and Rees have done. We also have an understanding of what happens if we ignore decays at the analysis stage. What happens to our sample size? What happens to our confidence intervals? They can be too wide or too narrow. If you have questions, please ask me now. Get in touch with me via email. And if you want to read more, then here are some references. Thanks very much.
Thank you for a nice talk, and also for absolutely perfect timing to the second.
Apart from my error with the slides.
So does anybody have any questions? Again, particularly encourage questions from those online, but while we're waiting, there's a couple of questions in the audience.
Thanks so much. It's Liz Turner. That was wonderful. Thanks, Jess. Do you have any practical recommendations for how to then make a choice of where on that curve you may choose to go? And the second related question is, what about the fact that the exchangeable correlation is estimated? What recommendations for using any imprecision on that estimate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I think where you choose along this line, you will have some idea of that intra-cluster correlation. I think you can probably restrict your range depending on what you know about correlation there, and that estimated ICC that you get from the exchangeable or the block exchangeable model will help there. As for using precision, I think that's a great idea too, using a few different values of that exchangeable ICC and plugging those in and seeing how that changes things.
Are there any questions online?
Stephanie Dixon asked, can you provide the Shiny app name again?
There we go, right there.
Okay, fair enough. Still got time for another question or two.
I have another one online.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Min Hyun asked, is it possible to take into account the transition period in stepped wedge and their impact on the decaying correlation?
Oh, absolutely. I think if you've got that transition period in your stepped wedge, this is going to have an impact on the number of periods that you're looking at. So if I go back, for example, to back. Okay, so if we've got something like this, instead of a 4-period design, we've got a 5-period design where we've got that transition period. Then when we come to consider the time over which that original exchangeable correlation was estimated, we would incorporate that in this calculation here of how many periods we have over that entire chunk of time. That's not a very clear answer, but please feel free to get in touch with me via email and I can explain more clearly to that person.
Okay, thank you very much. So next up, we've got Olivier, who's going to talk about the ICC. I'm sure that's everybody's favourite parameter. And I'm hopeful that his slides are going to be the right way up from the start. Let's see, I'm in suspense.
Hello, everybody. My name is Olivier Kasza. I am a statistician at the PCTU of the Queen Mary University of London. And today I'm going to talk to you about a Shiny app that I developed for cluster randomized trial that is called Get Help with the ICC. So first, just a little background to begin with. So the ICC is a measure of similarity at the cluster level. It's usually between 0 and 1. And if we have high ICC estimate, we would expect a lot of similarities between individuals within the same clusters. The ICC is important because it has an impact on statistical power. If it's underestimated during the sample size calculation, that we might not have enough power to detect the effect of the intervention. And if it's overestimated, we might recruit too much participants in a trial that is not necessary. So it's important to get interested in the ICC before the trial in order to do the sample size calculation. It might be also interesting to estimate the ICC during the trial if possible, to maybe do a sample size reassessment. And of course, at the end of the trial, to communicate our ICC estimates on publications. And how estimate the ICC? Well, of course, that depends on the situation, but there's lots of methods. Bayesian methods, mixed methods, and lots of other methods. So I think there are two major problems with the ICC, and the first one is when we guess an ICC estimate for the sample size calculation. We know that some slight modifications in the value of the ICC can have an important impact on the sample size, and the ICC can be quite unpredictable, especially with trials with few clusters. And the second problem is when we do not see ICC estimates on publications, although it's recommended by the consort statement for cluster randomized trials. So basically, these two problems that motivated the app, and so it's for the people who would need help. So when we connect to the app, this is actually what we see. This is the interface, and there are different things that we can do with the ICC, and those things are described in the text in italic. And so the first thing that we have to do, we have to choose a framework to tell the app what we want to do with the ICC. And we are going to see these different frameworks through examples. And the first one is the outcome proportions, because this is the first one that I developed for the app. And this is based on an example of a step wedge trial. So this step wedge trial was at the design stage before the sample size calculation. The outcome was or is binary, and they were able to know the proportions of the outcome in all of the clusters because they had routine data, and in the routine data, they could identify the clusters. They actually used this routine data because they wanted to have information on the design. They wanted to know how many participants they would be able to recruit in a certain period of time. But when it came to sample size calculation, they actually guessed a value because they didn't know that they could have estimated an ICC with the outcome proportions or prevalence. So if we have the proportions of the outcome in all of the clusters disposed in a vertical manner, such as we can see in the example, we can actually load this into the app and it will estimate the ICC via a formula that is based on a beta binomial distribution. And when we click on graphs, we can actually see the distribution of the proportions and the theoretical beta binomial distribution that is used for the sample size calculation. So it's actually better than just guessing a value because it's based on something, but it's still not ideal because the ICC can evolve through time, and the value of the ICC during the trial might be different than the ICC in the routine data. So it might be quite a good idea to incorporate some uncertainty in that ICC estimate, which is possible with another framework of the app, which is called the uncertainty framework. So if we have the ICC estimate and the total number of individual and the number of clusters, we can have the 95 confidence interval with different methods. But something that we have to bear in mind is that these methods suppose equal cluster sizes. To my knowledge, there are some methods that exist for different cluster sizes, but it would be too complicated because it would require the user to give the number of individuals within all of the clusters, and this would not be practical. Okay, but of course, we do not have always access to routine data, and the outcome is not always binary, and that leads me to the next framework that is called the previous estimates framework. So the idea of that is quite simple. We actually want to have an information about the ICC based on the information that is already available on publications. And we want to derive a posterior distribution from relevant ICC estimates selected on sources. So this is a Bayesian method based on an article of Rebecca Turner. And so this is one of the models, but there are several ones. And what we need is ICC estimates with a study identifier M and an outcome identifier L. And in the app, we can actually download the template and complete the template before loading this file, and then the app would do the rest. So when we click on download the template, this is actually a template being completed. So we have our ICC estimates, and this is the number of individual, and K, the number of clusters, the outcome ID and the study ID, and we can also affect a weight for the outcome or the study, because if the outcome of the ICC is very close to the outcome that I want to do for my trial, or if the study settings are very similar, I would want to give more importance to those ICC estimates. And when we load the file, that implements different models. We can see the example model 3 and model 4. And usually what is being done is that it's the 97.5 percentile that is chosen for the sample size calculation. Okay, and with the app, we can also estimate the ICC with outcome data. The outcome could be continuous or binary. And what we would need is a file with 2 columns, the first one for the cluster identifier and the second one for the outcome. And so we can estimate the ICC during and or at the end of the trial when we have data for all the clusters. But the data should be from the same time point because, as we said, the ICC can evolve through time. And we can see in the example the classical step wedge design. And we know that for the step wedge design, the time trend can act as a confounder. And this is not taken into account into the app. And so, for example, we could extract the data from the first period of observation because all the clusters are in the control condition, but also at the last period of observation because all the clusters are in the intervention condition, and this would be the most recent ICC estimate at the end of the trial. But if we estimate the ICC with period 2, 3, or 4, there are both clusters in the control and intervention condition. And so if the effect of the intervention is not null, then the ICC would be overestimated. But for some clusters designs, all the clusters are never in the same condition at the same time. This is the case for the crossover design, for example, but there are other designs in that case. And so if I want to estimate the ICC, I need to take into account the effect of the intervention. And so I would just have to answer the question, all data in same treatment condition, the answer would be no. And my file would need to have an additional column for the condition status. It could be 0, 1, or intervention control, it doesn't matter. And there could be more than just 2 conditions. And when it comes to graphs, the graphs will be split between condition status. Okay, so in conclusion, this is the link for the app, and this is the QR code as well. So this app is still in the testing mode. So if anybody would be interested in testing or collaborating in some way, feel free to get in contact with me. I've tried to do an app that is the easiest to use. I've tried to incorporate some flexibility in the import of data. Could be an Excel file or different types of file. Some messages to guide the users and images as well. And there is also a template for the Bayesian method. So this app can help the user in different kinds of scenarios. That is the frameworks that we saw, and also with multiple options. But if anybody thinks of any additional frameworks that could be interested, I'm also very interested in that. And so there are various types of ICC. I've tried to incorporate the most ICC estimates as possible to give the user the most important choice. And there are also various types of graphs, because I think it's always useful to see what our data looks like. And you can actually have a better idea of what is the ICC when you can actually visualize the graphs. And in terms of next steps, to this date, the app does not take into account the individual autocorrelation for designs with repeated measures at the individual level. And so I think it would be quite nice to give also the value of this correlation parameter. And it would be also nice to take into account different outcome types, such as ordinal or multinomial model, for example. So thank you for your attention. So if you have any question or suggestion or comments, I would be glad to hear them.
Great, thank you very much. Finished early, very good. So do we have any questions, either online or in the room?
Hi, is this turned on? Okay, I think it was slide 8. You had a column for measuring the similarity in outcomes. Slide 8, I think that's 7. Next 7. One.
This slide?
No, go to slide 8. 2 more.
No, you're going backwards.
Sorry. Yes. There we go. Yeah, so there's a column there for the outcome similarities, and you had all these different categories. I was just wondering how they were actually measured.
So it's, yeah.
So how did you define whether it was somewhat related or?
So actually, yeah, it's a label to choose the outcome weight. So there is, for example, for the outcome type, same outcome, similar outcome, or.
But what would you define as, like, how do you define the similarities?
Well, in actually, what in the app will be done is that it will be a numerical weight that would be incorporated based on the label that is chosen. But for example, if I want to do a trial and I see on publication that, for example, my outcome is a cholesterol level, and this is actually the same outcome that I have for my trial, then I can tell that into the app, and this would affect the maximum weight to these ICC estimates. And this is the same principle for the study weight.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any online questions? No. Any other questions from the room? Yep. Straight.
You guys. Thank you. It's Andrew Copas from UCL. And a great talk. I just wondered, had you thought of what to do when you do have some previous data, either individual level data or ICCs reported for a binary outcome, but it seems that the prevalence is different to what you expect in your population. So it might be that the previous study was in a sort of a low risk population and your study is going to be in the high risk, or vice versa, because the ICC for a binary outcome we'd expect to be linked to the prevalence. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on how to try and do some sort of conversion from that population to what you're interested in.
So you mean for the previous estimates? Yeah, I think that, of course, the ideal situation would be to find prevalences that would be very similar to the trial that I want to do. But it's actually a good question. I actually I'm not sure. I don't know. I think it would be interesting to see what would be the impact in terms of sample size calculation, whether it's a low prevalences or high prevalences. But yeah, this is a good question. I don't have any clear answer on that, but that's a good question.
I think Sandra has a paper that links the ICCs to the outcome proportion. If I remember right, it's got like a equation of a line, a rough line, whether there could be some sort of very rough, crude thing that could be done. My question was just for clarification, where people input their own data, I can't remember which slide it was, for continuous data, do they have to input the means? So these here are the means for each.
No. Here it's not the mean. It's
this is the actual raw
yeah.
data. Okay, right.
Yeah,
yeah, just the misinterpretation.
But for the another framework, which is the outcome proportions, this is the proportions.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much, Olivia. We're going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you very much. So next we've got Sam Watson from the University of Birmingham, which is my alma mater for what it's worth. And he's going to be talking about complex covariate structures.
This talk is about kind of estimating models with complex covariant structures. So we have a grant that looks at doing kind of experimental designs in spatial and spatio-temporal settings. That's Carla here and Yaqian here. We work on that. And so there's lots of elements to kind of experimental design in those complex settings, one of which being like an optimal experimental design, which I mentioned earlier, and other ones being, the sorts of treatment effects we can do, randomization schemes. But one thing that was of interest to us was how to estimate these models when you have a slightly more complex covariance function. So, we were interested in doing things where you might have a kind of spatial correlation, where things are more likely to be similar if they're nearer together in space, as well as temporal correlation. And sometimes this might interact with cluster structures. So you might have, you might want to say there's a group membership type effect here, and then some kind of spatial functions, temporal function at a kind of extreme level of complexity. But at a simple level, even the ones Jessica was talking about, with sort of an also regressive type structure or exponential decay type structure, there wasn't that many options for really estimating these models. So we sort of went down perhaps a rabbit hole of looking about how we can estimate them in a kind of frequentist setting. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Any luck with the slides? Okay.
You're only good at mime.
I'm trying to remember what I put in my slides. So where are we? Yeah. So the most common way people do, in a cluster trial is perhaps you have like kind of exchangeable or compound symmetric type covariance structures people have talked about. So you might at the simplest level just have a cluster level random effect. So if you're in that cluster, as Jessica was very well explaining, we just assume that everyone has a similar level of outcome because they're in a cluster. One step up from that might be you have sort of a temporal additional bit, so you're in the same cluster period. Then you might have, you'll say, oh, well, there's just a little bit of noise around that, so the mean within each cluster period sort of varies, but the distance in time doesn't matter. So we think, well, these might not be very realistic assumptions. So we might want to say, like just explaining, that actually people closer in time are going to be more similar to one another. So then the complexity builds up. Why? But we might say, why do we care about it being complex at all? Why not? Why do we need it to be more realistic? And so the normal answer to that is because if we estimated a model with no covariance and no cluster level correlation, the estimator in that model would still be unbiased for the treatment effect, right?
I just sort of think, would it be better if we break for lunch now, which should be in 5 minutes early, and you can do your talk after lunch with your slides? Is that...
I'm happy either way. Yeah.
Well, you can decide.
No, yeah. I mean, we take a vote. No, I'm happy.
Who votes for lunch?
Okay.
Thanks very much, because you really are a true pro being able to do this without the slides. But yeah, shall we break for lunch now, which should be in 5 minutes anyway, and then you can.
We'll take 5 minutes off after lunch of my talk.
No, I think you get your whole. Well, I won't be the chair actually, so. But if I were the chair, I would give you the whole time anyway. But
Well, thanks. Brilliant. So I can skip all, hopefully you'll remember all the preambles from before lunch, but just to, where should we start? Let's start here. So just to recap, so we're interested in estimating models with more complex covariant structures, and yet the software to do that is relatively limited. I mean, you could take a Bayesian approach, with MCMC, you can estimate kind of very complex models, but often we want particularly in experimental settings, frequentist or likelihood-based approaches. So we were interested in that. So we looked into kind of what software is available where we could be a bit more creative with specifying our covariance functions. And it's fairly limited. So I'll go through some of what is available, and then I'll go through an approach, and then we've sort of built a package to do a kind of full likelihood approaches for a huge range of models. And so I'll discuss that. But first, perhaps the question is why? So on the top, we have a sort of ordinary linear model. You can estimate that ordinary least squares. And at the bottom, we have perhaps the more common approach when you've got clusters and cluster periods, where you have a cluster random effect and cluster period random effect. Here are individuals are I, clusters are J, time is T. Both of these models for the, generally speaking, both of these models for the treatment effect are unbiased, notwithstanding, informative cluster sizes and all sorts of things like this. So why would we go for this complex model over the less complex one? Generally speaking, it's because the random effects, we can perhaps think of them as implementing a formal device, perhaps implementing a smoother to capture that correlation. So we want the correct standard errors, really, is what we're trying to say. And generally speaking, if X is correctly specified, then it's going to be unbiased, whatever we do. Although in a parallel trial, we can even make mistakes with X and we'll still get the right, an unbiased answer. So it's a question of getting the right standard errors. And so there's a question about what's complex. Now, Jessica gave I won't go into this one any more detail because you should hopefully remember Jessica aptly describing how this one all works. But another option might be, so for example, an exponential covariance function like this. These perhaps I'll put Mattern family, if you're familiar with geospatial statistics, that family of functions is very common, and that's why we sort of picked up on these ones, because if we're interested in spatial and temporal correlations, this family of functions are quite useful. So how do we estimate these sorts of models? And perhaps the first question is, why are they hard to estimate? Oh, I did make this font a bit bigger, so squint and you might be able to see what's going on there. So the likelihood, so this first term here, f of y, is the likelihood for our observations, and we focusing on exponential family models, binomial, Poisson, Gaussian, and then we have our random effects, which we assume multivariate normally distributed. So we have the multivariate normal distribution, but of course the random effects are not observed, so we sort of have to get rid of them. They're nuisance parameters, and the way we can do that is to marginalize them out, or integrate them out. But that's obviously a very difficult integral and generally doesn't have a closed form. So what do we do? Perhaps the most common approach is named after this gentleman here, which is named Pierre Simon Laplace. Laplace. So Laplace's approximation, if we can write an integral in the form at the bottom, then it's quite a computationally fast way of approximating that integral. And for those exponential family models, we can write it in that form. So we can use a Laplace approximation. And indeed, that's what a lot of packages use for these more complex models. So I imagine most people, this is in R, are familiar with LME4. I think last time I looked, it has over 20 million downloads or something. So it's a very popular piece of software. Although I think most people download each software package maybe 30, 50 times as they keep reinstalling things. So there's still a lot of users though. So this uses a Laplace approximation for nonlinear models. It also does adaptive quadrature. but it's limited to exchangeable or sometimes compound symmetric or group membership type random effects. So we can't use it for more complex methods. There's also in R this GLM, PQL, and LME that uses kind of quasi-likelihood approaches, has a wider range of covariant structures. Perhaps more modern is this GLM TMB. TMB stands for Template Model Builder. This is perhaps the best one in terms of the Laplace approximation, because there's a wide range of covariance functions, including exponential decay. But the problem with the exponential decay model it has, or the autoregressive one, is that the time periods have to be equally spaced apart. But there's a growing interest in continuous time models for cluster trials. You know, we often don't have things happening equal spaces and time. It's just a useful tool to make things a bit simpler. But if we've got continuous recruitment into our clusters and things like that, continuous time might make more sense. And that's where these, you know, autoregressive or exponential temporal covariance functions make perhaps more sense. And GLM TMB does offer a good range of functions for that. But again, it's uses approximation, but it's very fast. It's very useful. And I know I remember to use a Carla reminded me in SAS, you can estimate autoregressive covariance. That also uses Laplace approximation. But these are all approximations. For exchangeable correlation structures, it's probably a pretty good approximation. And I think particularly for LME4, there's been tons of simulation studies using that software, and generally it performs as we want it to perform. So I think it's one of the few bits of software that you can use for regulatory analyses as well. They allow it. But again, it depends. So a colleague of ours, John Bishop, he kind of looked at this Stater and SAS methods, and you can kind of turn up the number of integration points on Gauss quadrature, and it will actually then start giving you slightly different answers until it gets to a kind of better and better approximation. So even with those simpler covariance structures, the approximation might not be that good. Well, we don't really know because we've got not much to compare it against. So the alternative is, well, what can we use instead of an approximation? You know, if we were doing a Bayesian analysis, there's lots of deterministic or approximate Bayesian approaches, but people would say that's just to kind of explore the model. You should use the full MCMC, the full model, if you're going to do analysis to report to the public that decisions are going to depend upon. So what can we do? Is there a full likelihood way of fitting these sorts of models? And there is. It's called Markov chain Monte Carlo maximum likelihood. And I've just sort of outlined how the algorithm works here. Essentially, you given a value of beta and theta are covariance parameters, you draw samples of the random effects using MCMC. So we're treating the random effects here, rather than integrating them out, we're treating them as missing data, and we're simulating values for them. And then we estimate beta conditional on those new simulated values. And then we estimate the covariance parameters given the simulated values and keep repeating this cycle until all the parameters converge. And then there's a nice paper that shows that works as a full likelihood approach for these sorts of models. But there isn't much that implements this. In fact, I'm not aware of any software that does implement it. And I think one reason is because it's incredibly so, it's pretty slow. You've got to do lots of steps. You've got to do an MCMC step, 2 model fitting steps, and then do that quite a few times to get them to converge. But we thought, well, we want full likelihood methods on a wide range of covariance structures. So we built some software to do it. I won't go into that one. I'll just explain. How long have I got? A few minutes? Okay. Okay. So we built some software to do it. Kind of a range of software because we thought this is quite good, and we want to have, like I said at the beginning, a range of covariance functions. So we want to say, well, there's group membership structure. There's going to be some spatial correlation within clusters, which has this functional form. And then we want to add on some other functional form, the temporal or something, anything like that, any combination of things we did like that. So we built some software to do it. And then on top of that, to fit MCMC ML type models. And there's a few things you can do to make it go a bit faster, like you can use a kind of Cholesky decomposition instead of the full matrix, covariance matrix, and then you can avoid inverting any matrices, which is typically why evaluating a multivariate normal likelihood is really slow, because you've got to invert that matrix there. And you can do things like using, this blocks, which it always is in a group membership structure. You can just look at the blocks separately and then add up all the results from that. So we kind of implemented everything we could think of to make it a bit faster. For the MCMC step, you can sort of, again, use the Cholesky decomposition and then sample from a load of standard normals for the MCMC step, which is a lot quicker and it converges a lot faster than if you did it with the kind of more complex random effect structures. So we put all this stuff in to try and make it go a bit faster. I'll come back to, so I won't go into the kind of, if you're interested, I can talk to you about kind of, we tried to go for a nice way of specifying models that was fairly intuitive and simple, and the output matching like all the other software that does it. So how does it compare? So for a model with like the exchangeable correlation structure with cluster and cluster period effects, LME4 are about 500 people in 10 clusters and 5 time periods. LME4 probably 100 milliseconds, maybe a bit shorter, maybe a bit longer. R1 with all our little tweaks and things, I mean, 1 second, it might take a little bit longer actually, but like it's in the range of 1 to 5 seconds. So if you were doing an analysis, that's actually fine. I mean, I'll be willing to wait 10 minutes if I need to, if it's the kind of final analysis. But it is, relatively speaking, it's incredibly slow. It's 100 times slower, 1,000 times slower. So if we want to do things like simulation studies to compare performance, that's a kind of barrier, because we can't then do 10 million runs of this and see which parameters it works well for, where it works poorly for. But we do want to do that, because if the approximation performs as well as the full likelihood method, why would you bother with the full likelihood method? It's much slower. You have to tweak it a bit and things. So our next step is to try and find out ways we can use simulation-based methods to look at the performance of these two types of approaches. And so we want to kind of look at we're looking at a kind of adaptive simulation type methods, where you sort of sample the parameter values to look at an adaptive way where the probability of it kind of having poor or good performance changes. But I won't go into that one in too much detail. So I know we're short on time. So hopefully that's given you a brief kind of idea of where we are with model fitting. And this software is in its kind of second version, and I think we'll submit to CRAN soon. But we're going to write away and publish it, because I'm assuming people in this room might be interested in it, or people interested in these sorts of models. So hopefully that's of interest to you, and I provided a good advert for our software, and you'll be all clamoring to use it soon. But thank you very much.
Hi, Jenny Thompson from London School of Hygiene. Does it, or will there be future work to get it to do restricted maximum likelihood estimation?
So restricted, why would you? I don't suppose you'd need restricted, would you? If it's,
well, often you find it works better if you have a small number of clusters.
I suppose the answer should be no. We aren't planning to go down that route, but I mean, and yeah, like you say, it's the small number of clusters problem is a problem, whatever method you use, really. I suppose one could apply corrections to these results, but we're not planning to add anything. But, I mean, if it's worth doing, then maybe we could do it.
Thank you.
Any other questions in the audience?
Thanks so much, Sam. It's very much needed. We've been looking for a long time, different bits of software. We had to use AS-REML, which is a commercial package, to be able to fit the exponential decay model, until the GLMM TMB came along. Have you done any time comparisons versus GLMM TMB?
Yes, yeah. So it's I think GLMM TMB performs similarly to LME4. It's like milliseconds or hundreds of milliseconds versus maybe a second or two. So you're probably 100 times slower. But it probably scales about the same though. So yeah, it's not like our scale approximately is like n squared, maybe n cubed, probably n cubed actually. But yes, it's slower, but produces similar results in comparable situations. But we want to do kind of a forward simulation based type comparisons to see if the extra time is worth it or not.